You know that feeling when you're sitting alone in your room late at night and the silence feels different than it used to. Not empty, just separate, like you're breathing air that nobody else around you can quite reach. You've grown, you've changed. You've opened yourself to truths that shift how you see the world, how you move through your days, how you listen when people speak. And somewhere along that path, you started noticing something strange. The people you used to feel close to now feel distant, even when they're standing right in front of you. Conversations that used to flow now feel like you're translating between languages nobody else knows you're speaking. If I were to tell you that this loneliness you're carrying isn't a sign that something went wrong, you might not believe me at first. You might think it's just isolation dressed up in softer words. But what if I told you it's neither punishment nor accident? What if this distance you feel is actually the beginning of something else entirely? Something most people never allow themselves to experience because the cost of it feels too high. What if you're not falling behind? What if you're being prepared? It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where you woke up and everything felt foreign. It was subtler than that. It started with small things. A pause before you answered when someone asked how you were doing. That split second where you calculated what version of yourself they could handle, what truth would fit into the shape of the conversation they expected. You started noticing how much energy it took to show up at family dinners, how you'd smile and nod while feeling like you were watching yourself from somewhere else in the room. The words coming out of your mouth felt rehearsed, like lines from a play you'd performed so many times you forgot you were acting. And then afterwards, when you were alone again, there was this strange relief. Not the loneliness you expected to feel, but something closer to exhale. Like you could finally stop translating. Stop bending yourself into shapes that used to fit but don't anymore. Your friends would text, and you'd stare at the messages, trying to find the energy to explain things you knew they wouldn't understand. Not because they're not intelligent. Not because they don't care. But because the language you're learning to speak doesn't have words they recognize yet. This shift happens in stages. Most people don't realize they're in stage 1 until they're already deep into stage 3, looking back at who they used to be and barely recognizing that person. And by then, the distance isn't something you can just close by trying harder. They see you pulling away. They notice you're quieter now, that you don't laugh at the same jokes, that you leave gatherings earlier than you used to. And in their minds, something simple is happening. You've changed. You think you're better than them now. You've become distant, cold, maybe even arrogant. They might say it directly or just in the way they look at you, like you're a stranger wearing a familiar face. And you feel it, that accusation hanging in the air between you. The guilt that comes with it, heavy and confusing. Because part of you wonders if they're right. Maybe you are the problem. Maybe you should try harder to be who you used to be. But here's what's actually happening, what they can't see from where they're standing. You're not pulling away because you think you're above them. You're stepping back because staying in conversations that don't touch anything real anymore feels like drowning in shallow water. You're not being cold. You're protecting something tender that's growing inside you, something that gets trampled when you try to explain it to people who aren't asking the questions you're asking. It's like you're suddenly seeing in color and everyone around you is still seeing in black and white. And when you try to describe blue or green or gold, they look at you like you're speaking nonsense. They're not wrong for seeing what they see. And you're not wrong for experiencing what you're experiencing. You're just standing in different places now, looking at the same world through completely different eyes. And the reason they can't follow you into this deeper way of seeing isn't about intelligence or goodness or love. It's about something else entirely. Something that has nothing to do with capacity and everything to do with timing. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with seeing more than you used to. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone, though sometimes that's part of it. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling like you're standing on the other side of glass. You can see them, you can hear them, but there's this transparent barrier between you and everyone else, and nobody seems to notice it's there except you. You watch people move through their lives, talking about things that used to matter to you, problems that used to feel urgent, dreams that used to make sense. And you feel this ache, not because you judge them, but because you remember being there. You remember when those things were enough, when the surface of life was all there was, and that felt complete. But something happened. You started asking different questions. You started noticing patterns nobody around you seemed to see. You started feeling the weight of things that don't have names, sensing dimensions of existence that don't show up in normal conversation. And now you're here, in this strange in-between place, where you can't go back to who you were, but you haven't fully arrived at wherever you're going. History is full of people like you, the ones who went into the wilderness alone, the monks who climbed mountains and stayed there, the artists who locked themselves in rooms for years, the mystics who spoke in riddles because direct truth was too bright for ordinary eyes. They weren't running away from the world. They were learning to see it from a different angle, learning to hear frequencies most people's ears aren't tuned to yet, and that kind of seeing requires silence, space, distance from the noise. You're living in two worlds at once. One foot in the life everyone else recognizes, one foot in something deeper, stranger, more real than anything you can explain at dinner tables or in text messages. And it hurts. There's grief in this expansion. You're not just gaining new sight, you're losing the comfort of blindness. But this loneliness you're carrying isn't random suffering. It's not punishment for growing. It serves a purpose, an evolutionary function that only becomes clear when you look back from the other side. Right now, in the middle of it, it just feels like isolation. But it's not. It's initiation. Here's what's actually happening when you feel that growing distance. Consciousness doesn't expand the same way in everyone at the same time. It's not like a rising tide that lifts all boats equally. It's more like light moving through a room, touching some corners before others, illuminating in patterns that don't follow any rule you can predict. Your awareness has opened. You've started seeing layers beneath the surface of things. Questions that used to have simple answers now branch into deeper questions. Experiences that used to be flat now have texture, dimension, weight. But the people around you, the ones you love, the ones you've known for years, they're not seeing what you're seeing. Not because they're less capable, not because something's wrong with them, but because their consciousness simply hasn't shifted yet. Think about learning a new language. Once you understand it, once you can think in it, you can't force someone else to suddenly comprehend it just because you do. They have to go through their own process of learning, their own hours of confusion and gradual understanding. Consciousness works the same way. You can't hand someone your realizations like passing a book across a table. They have to arrive at their own insights through their own experience. And this is why you feel so alone sometimes. You're operating with an expanded aperture now. You're perceiving more data, more nuance, more complexity in every moment. It's like you've developed the ability to see infrared or ultraviolet wavelengths that were always there but invisible to you before. And now you can see them. But when you try to point them out, when you try to share what you're seeing, people look at where you're pointing and see nothing. They're not being difficult. Their eyes simply aren't adjusted yet. What you're going through follows stages, predictable phases that every person who expands beyond their previous limits must navigate. And knowing which phase you're in changes everything about how to move through it. Right now you might be in the disorientation phase, where everything feels strange and nothing makes sense. Or maybe you're deeper in the integration phase, trying to make peace with your new way of seeing. Either way, understanding the map helps. It shows you this isn't madness. it's movement. There's a reason certain relationships feel effortless, while others suddenly require so much energy you can barely maintain them. It has to do with frequency, not in some mystical way that can't be explained, but in a very real way. Every person operates at a certain level of awareness, a certain speed of processing, a certain depth of feeling and thinking. When two people are at similar frequencies, conversation flows naturally. Understanding happens without effort. Silence between you feels comfortable, not awkward. But when frequencies no longer match, everything becomes work. You say something and watch it land wrong. They share something and you feel yourself nodding while knowing you can't access what they're actually trying to communicate. It's like trying to tune two radios to play the same station, but one of them keeps drifting off frequency. The static between you isn't anyone's fault. You haven't become incompatible as people, you've just shifted to different bandwidths. They're still broadcasting on the frequency you used to share, but you've moved. Your signal is coming through on a different channel now, and their receiver isn't tuned there yet. This explains why some friendships that felt unbreakable suddenly feel impossible to maintain. Why family gatherings leave you exhausted. Why you'd rather be alone than force yourself into spaces that require constant translation. Your frequency has changed, and most of the people in your life are still where you used to be. There are signs when someone's ready to shift. Subtle markers that their frequency is starting to move, that they're asking questions they didn't ask before, feeling tensions they didn't feel before. Most people miss these signs completely. But once you learn to recognize them, once you understand what readiness actually looks like, everything about how you navigate relationships changes. You've probably tried it. Sitting someone down, someone you love, someone you want to bring with you into this deeper way of seeing. And you've tried to explain what you're experiencing, what you're learning, what's becoming so clear to you now. You've shared books or videos or ideas, hoping something would click for them the way it clicked for you. And maybe they listened politely. Maybe they even seemed interested for a moment. But then nothing changed. They went right back to how they were, and you felt frustrated, confused, maybe even a little hurt that they didn't care enough to meet you where you are. Here's what you need to understand. They can't follow you. Not yet. Not because they don't love you. Not because they're not intelligent enough or conscious enough or willing enough. But because consciousness doesn't work on command. You can't talk someone into awakening. You can't convince them into deeper seeing. Readiness isn't something you can create in another person through logic or passion or evidence. It's something that emerges from within them, according to timing that has nothing to do with you. Think about every failed attempt you've made to enlighten someone. Every conversation where you could feel yourself pushing, trying to make them see, growing more intense as they grew more resistant. That resistance wasn't stubbornness. It was protection. Their consciousness wasn't ready for what you were offering, and some part of them knew it. Trying to force awareness before readiness is like trying to make fruit ripen faster by pulling on it. All you do is damage what would have opened naturally in its own time. This is one of the hardest truths to accept when you start evolving faster than the people around you. You have to let them be where they are. You have to release the missionary complex, the urgency to save or wake or elevate them. Not because you don't care, but because caring sometimes means trusting their timing more than your insights. Alan Watts used to talk about this. How the universe doesn't make mistakes, how every person is exactly where they need to be for their own unfolding. Fighting against someone else's pace is like arguing with a river about which direction it should flow. Some relationships are meant to dissolve when their purpose completes, when what brought you together has been fully experienced and learned from. And trying to keep those relationships alive past their natural ending only creates suffering for both people. But other relationships, the ones built on something deeper than shared habits or history, those can evolve. They can stretch to hold both people as they grow, As they change, as they become versions of themselves neither of them could have predicted. The difference between relationships that end and relationships that evolve determines everything about how you'll move through this next phase of your life. But here's where things can go wrong, where the very evolution you're experiencing can twist into something that separates you even further, not because you're growing but because you're hiding. There's a danger most people don't see coming. You start using your awareness as a shield. You start living so high above your emotions that you forget you still have a body, still have feelings that need to be felt, still have human messiness that doesn't disappear just because you understand it differently now. You tell yourself you've transcended anger, but really you're just suppressing it. You say you're beyond needing connection, but what you've actually done is build walls so thick that nothing can touch you anymore. You start collecting spiritual concepts like armor. You talk about frequency and vibration and consciousness levels, and somewhere in that talking you've created a new kind of hierarchy where you're at the top and everyone else is still asleep. This isn't evolution. This is ego wearing enlightenment like a costume. It's using awareness to avoid being human instead of becoming more fully human. And the tricky part is that it feels like growth. It feels like you're ascending above all the petty concerns that trap other people. But what's really happening is you're detaching from your own life, floating above it, observing it from a distance that feels safe but isn't real. You've turned consciousness into another way to be special, another way to be separate, another way to not have to deal with the ordinary struggles of being alive. There are three ways this distortion happens. The first is emotional bypass, where you spiritualize your pain instead of feeling it, where every hurt becomes a lesson and every loss becomes meant to be, and you never actually grieve or rage or break the way humans need to sometimes. The second is intellectual inflation, where you've learned so much about consciousness that you've forgotten how to just be conscious, where knowledge has replaced experience and you're living in concepts instead of presence. And the third one, the one that's almost impossible to see in yourself, the one that creeps in so quietly you don't notice until it's already shaped everything, is the belief that your awareness makes you fundamentally different from other humans. Better, more evolved, chosen. That's when evolution becomes delusion. And then there's another trap that's just as dangerous. When isolation stops being a phase and starts becoming who you are. When you build your entire identity around being the one who sees what others don't, the one who can't relate, the one who's too deep for surface level connection. You start wearing your loneliness like a badge. Proof that you're different, that you're on a path most people will never understand. And there's something seductive about that story. It makes the pain mean something. It turns your separation into evidence of your specialness. But you have to ask yourself an honest question, even if the answer is uncomfortable. Are you actually evolving, or are you just isolating? Are you being called into deeper truth, or are you running from the difficulty of showing up in the world as you actually are? Because there's a difference between necessary solitude and self-imposed exile. There's a difference between needing space to integrate what you're learning and hiding from human contact, because it's easier than being vulnerable. Some people go to the mountain to find truth, and they never come back down. They stay up there alone, convinced that their isolation is spiritual when really it's just fear with a prettier name. They've mistaken detachment for enlightenment. They've confused being alone with being awake. And years pass and they wonder why their lives feel so empty despite all their awareness, why their hearts feel so cold despite all their understanding. This is the turning point most people miss. The moment where solitude shifts from healing into hiding, where the silence stops being medicine and starts being a prison you've built yourself. And if you miss that turning point, if you let isolation become your identity instead of just a temporary phase, you can lose years to it. You can lose your entire life to it, actually. Convinced you're transcending when you're really just disappearing. There's something else that happens when you chase higher consciousness without staying connected to what makes you human. You start to lose feeling. Not in a peaceful way, in a numb way. Colors look duller. Music doesn't move you like it used to. You can analyze beauty, but you can't feel it anymore. You understand love conceptually, but you've forgotten what it's like to be cracked open by it, vulnerable to it, changed by it. You've become so focused on expanding your awareness that you've abandoned your heart. You've learned to observe your emotions from a distance, to witness them without being in them, and somewhere along the way you stopped feeling them at all. You watch people laugh, and you remember that you used to know how that felt, that uncontrollable joy that takes over your whole body. But now when you laugh, it's more like a performance, something you do because it's socially appropriate, not because anything actually strikes you as funny anymore. You're too aware to be surprised, too conscious to be moved, too elevated to be affected by the simple things that make life worth living. This is the cost nobody warns you about. The real danger of pursuing consciousness without keeping one foot on the ground. You can become so enlightened that you forget how to be a person, so awake that you're no longer alive in any way that matters. Indigenous traditions understood this. They had practices specifically designed to keep seekers tethered to the earth, even as they explored higher realms. Rituals that brought them back into their bodies. Communities that held them accountable to staying human. But most Western seekers, most people walking this path alone in their apartments with their books and their meditations, they don't have those safeguards. They float higher and higher until one day they look down and realize they've lost contact with everything that made them real. And by then, the way back feels impossible. You've become so detached that even wanting to feel again feels like regression, like giving up everything you've worked so hard to achieve. But here's the truth. Consciousness without humanity isn't enlightenment. It's just a different kind of sleep. So if you've made it this far without losing yourself to the traps, if you're still here, still human, still feeling, then you need to understand something. This awareness you've gained isn't just for you. It comes with responsibility. Not the heavy kind that weighs you down, but the natural kind that emerges when you see more clearly than you used to. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you've learned. And now that you have this expanded perspective, you have a choice about what to do with it. You can keep it to yourself, guard it, live your private awakening in isolation. Or you can learn how to carry it back into the world. How to embody it in a way that doesn't require words. How to become a presence that others feel even if they can't explain what they're feeling. This is what the old traditions called the path of the Bodhisattva, the one who awakens and then returns to help others awaken, not through preaching or teaching or converting, but through simply being, through living in a way that makes the invisible visible. And that requires navigating 3 specific challenges. The first is finding others who operate at your frequency. The second is maintaining connections with those who don't while staying true to what you know. And the third is learning to integrate everything you've discovered so it becomes who you are, not just what you think. The people who understand you without explanation, who speak your language without having to learn it, they won't show up the way you expect. You can't find them by searching. You can't manufacture that kind of connection by joining the right groups, or attending the right gatherings, or following the right spiritual teachers. That's not how frequency works. What happens instead is stranger, more organic. You'll be in a random place, doing something ordinary, and you'll meet someone, and within minutes you'll both feel it. That recognition, like you've known each other before even though you've never met. Conversations that go deep immediately, skipping all the surface level getting to know you rituals that usually take months. It's not about shared interests or similar backgrounds, it's about resonance. Your frequencies align and suddenly communication is effortless. These people might show up online, in comments or messages that feel different from all the others. They might appear at work, in your neighborhood, in the most unexpected contexts. Sometimes they're there for a season, teaching you something you needed to learn, reflecting back parts of yourself you couldn't see alone. Sometimes they stay, becoming the core of a new kind of family, one built on consciousness rather than blood. But you can't force this. You can't make it happen faster by trying harder or looking more intentionally. All you can do is become more fully yourself, more authentic in how you show up, more honest about what you're actually experiencing. And when you do that, when you stop pretending and start broadcasting your real frequency, you become a signal that others can tune into. They find you. Or maybe it's more accurate to say you find each other, drawn together by something neither of you chose but both of you recognize. That's your frequency tribe. Not the people you wish understood you. The people who already do. But what about everyone else? The family you were born into. The friends you've known since childhood. The people who love you but don't understand what's happening to you, can't follow where you're going, might never speak the language you're learning. Do you just let those relationships die? Accept that growth means leaving everyone behind. Not necessarily. There's another way. It requires something most people don't think about when they're focused on their own evolution. It requires learning how to translate, how to meet people where they are without pretending to be someone you're not. Think of it like this. You've learned a new language, one with words for experiences they haven't had yet. But you still remember your first language. You still know how to speak in ways they understand. The skill is knowing when to use which language, when to share your deeper insights, and when to simply be present with someone in their reality without needing to change it. This doesn't mean lying. It doesn't mean hiding who you've become. It means choosing what to share and how to share it based on what someone can actually receive in that moment. You can talk to your mother about what you're learning without using words like consciousness or frequency or awakening. You can describe your experiences in language she recognizes, through stories and feelings rather than concepts. You can stay connected to old friends by focusing on what you still genuinely share, rather than highlighting everything that's different now. And you can do all of this while maintaining complete integrity, never betraying what you know to be true, never shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. It's about flexibility, not falsehood. About having enough mastery over your own awareness that you're not threatened by entering someone else's worldview temporarily. The most evolved beings throughout history, the ones who actually changed things, they didn't isolate themselves at the top of mountains forever. They learned how to walk among people who didn't see what they saw. They learned how to speak truth in ways that could be heard. That's not compromise. That's skill. And there's a specific way of using language that allows you to share what you know without triggering defensive reactions, without making people feel lesser, without creating the very separation you're trying to bridge. It's the method mystics have always used when they wanted to plant seeds rather than start arguments. The time you spend alone right now, the hours that feel like exile, they're not wasted. They're not evidence that something's wrong with you, or that you've failed a connection. This solitude is actually doing something. It's giving you space that most people never allow themselves. Space to hear your own thoughts without the static of other people's expectations. Space to feel what you actually feel instead of what you think you should feel. Space to discover who you are when nobody's watching, when there's no role to play, no audience to perform for. Every mystic who ever lived spent time in this kind of aloneness, not because they hated people, but because depth requires silence. Integration requires stillness. You can't process what you're learning, can't make sense of what you're seeing, can't let new awareness settle into your bones if you're constantly surrounded by noise. The hermits who went to caves weren't running away. They were going toward something. The artists who locked themselves in studios for months weren't avoiding life. They were mining it, going deeper than surface living allows. Your solitude is the same. It's sacred work disguised as loneliness. And if you treat it that way, if you use this time intentionally instead of just suffering through it, something shifts. You start to notice patterns, cycles of needing to withdraw and then naturally wanting to re-engage. And those cycles aren't random. They follow a rhythm. Your consciousness expands, and you need time alone to integrate what's expanded. Then you emerge briefly to test your new understanding in the world. Then you withdraw again to process what that engagement taught you. Knowing when to emerge, recognizing the signs that your solitude phase is complete, that's critical. Come out too early and you're not ready. Stay too long and the isolation becomes its own trap. But none of this matters if it stays in your head. All the awareness, all the insights, all the deeper seeing, it means nothing if it doesn't change how you actually live. How you treat the cashier at the grocery store. How you listen when someone's talking to you. How you move through your ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Consciousness isn't something you achieve and then display like a trophy. It's something you become. And becoming happens in the smallest moments, the ones nobody sees, the ones that don't look spiritual at all. Washing dishes with full attention. Feeling your breath while you're stuck in traffic. Noticing beauty in things you used to walk past without seeing. This is where most seekers fail. They collect knowledge but never bring it down into their hands, their habits, their actual moment-to-moment choices. And there's a reason why. Integration is harder than expansion. Coming back to Earth is harder than floating above it. But without it, everything you've learned is just theory. So what was all of this for? The isolation, the misunderstanding, the loneliness that felt like it would break you, the distance that grew between you and everyone you used to know. What if I told you it wasn't random? What if every moment of that pain was preparing you for something specific? You're not evolving faster than others because you're special or chosen or better. You're evolving faster because you're being shaped into something the world needs. Someone who can hold more complexity. Someone who can see from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Someone who can stand in the space between worlds and translate for people who only speak one language. The old traditions had names for this. The bridge builder. The way shower. The one who walks between. Not because they wanted to, but because their consciousness expanded in a way that made them capable of it. You're being prepared to hold frequency for others. To anchor a different kind of awareness in spaces that desperately need it, but don't know how to access it yet. That's why you had to go through the isolation. You can't guide others through territory you haven't walked yourself. You can't hold space for someone's transformation if you haven't survived your own. Every moment you felt alone was teaching you how to be comfortable in the space between the old world and the new one. How to exist in that tension without collapsing. And now, whether you realize it or not, you're ready. The question is whether you'll step into that role. Whether you'll use what you've learned or keep it hidden, because fulfilling this requires one final shift. The shift from seeking to embodying. And most people never make it. You who felt so alone. You who couldn't understand why everyone around you seemed content with surfaces while you needed depth. You who thought something was broken in you because connection became so difficult. Because the old life stopped fitting. Because you couldn't go back to who you were even when you tried. Maybe it was never about them. Maybe it was never about finding people who understood you, or making your family see what you see, or bringing your friends along on this journey. Maybe it was about something quieter. Something that doesn't require anyone else's validation or recognition or participation. Maybe you weren't evolving away from others. Maybe you were evolving toward yourself. Toward the version of you that was always there, but couldn't emerge while you were still trying to fit into spaces that were too small. And now here you are, still learning, still stumbling sometimes, still feeling that strange loneliness that comes with seeing more than most people around you. But different now, not broken by it, not destroyed by the distance. You've found your way home to yourself. And that home, that internal place where you finally fit, where you don't have to translate or perform or shrink, it goes with you everywhere now. The people who are meant to find you will find you. The connections that are meant to form will form, but you don't need them to complete you anymore. You've become your own companion, your own teacher, your own home. And maybe that was the point all along, not to transcend your humanity, but to finally fully arrive inside it.